Hey baby, I'm back. I've tried to read this article a bunch of times now, and I just get so angry about John Howard and get derailed and lose my place. But we're going to try again. This is Greg Jericho, who his avatar on Blue Sky, and I think on Twitter as well. I think I was following him on Twitter when I had Twitter. Is Ray Fiennes from The English Patient, and I'm still just like confused every time I see his face on like a properly published article, being like, who the fuck is this? Anyway, he wrote something 2 years ago called Five Housing Policies That Wouldn't Drive Up Prices in Australia. If reforms to negative gearing and capital gains tax are a bridge too far, how about tackling supply? Yeah, May 2022. So housing affordability has taken centre stage in the campaign, and would you believe it, the policy is designed around pumping up demand. And this link takes you to, you can see the text down the bottom, coalition plan to allow first home buyers to access super will jack up house prices, which is exactly what it would do. Also, you wouldn't have your fucking super then, which should never have been privatized, should just have stayed a fucking retirement pension, but whatever. Yeah, pumping up demand rather than addressing supply. As economist Saul Eslake has noted, pretty much every major housing affordability policy going back to the 1960s has been about pumping up demand. This has especially been the case since 2000 and the John Howard years, when he was infamously quoted in 2003 saying, "I don't get people stopping me in the street and saying, 'John, you're outrageous. Under your government, the value of my house has increased.'" And just, yeah, he's malignant. And has pumped up demand worked to improve housing affordability? No. And we've got a nice little graph here. Property prices surged ahead of wages and inflation. Index of residential property prices, CPI and wage from with 1997 fixed at 100. So 1997 is what we're using for well, it depends a little bit which graph you go to, but for a relational graph here. And we got inflation, wages slightly ahead of inflation, and property prices from the John Howard years. Crazy. And you can get that data for yourself. Clicking this link will get you like a CVS download of it. But the sources are the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Bank of International Settlement. I don't know a lot about those guys. Their name seems suspicious to me. Just like banks are fucked. So what can we do that won't drive up housing prices? 1. Reduce the skewed tax incentives. Look, I know this is not going to happen, but that does not mean it should not still be pursued. A major issue with the housing market is that owner-occupiers are at a disadvantage to investors because the taxation system is skewed towards investors through two things: negative gearing and the capital gains 50% discount. Negative gearing was really just a few embers in the housing market. What caused it to turn into a bonfire was when John Howard poured petrol on it by changing how capital gains were discounted. The introduction of the 50% discount not only caused a massive surge in the level of capital gains, but also the amount of rental income that was now a loss. Capital gains tax changes set fire to negative gearing. Another graph. Orange is a period after the 50% capital gains was applied. So this version of the graph shows average capital gain. And it's plodding along up and down just a little bit within a couple of $1,000s until John Howard comes along. And then there's initially a drop, although I don't know what the financial, general state of the economy was like at that time, so that might not be related to the policy. We start with a drop, and then it's rather than maintaining this slow general upwards trend, it just becomes this fucking diagonal line when you put years against $2,000 at a bracket. So that's I don't like that at all. And the data this time comes from the ATO. It tells you which table to go to if you want to look up the tax statements, and you can get another CVS download as well. So if we change the graph to show average rental loss, so we've got rents up on this side and the years on this side, same thing. It's leveled out a bit after 2012, which there was a recession around here, right? I feel like, yeah, not long after I got out of school, there was a recession. It's like not anything crazy, but um, it's interesting to me that the dip during the financial crisis was only so much. The global financial crisis, I mean. Anyway, um, similar thing. So rent losses were plodding along with I don't know. I think if you average that, it wouldn't be trending upwards. Hey, I mean, we're only going back a few years beforehand, but afterwards, just a massive jump in the baseline and an initial tendency to increase quite dramatically. And we're picking up over here. I'm sure in the 2 years since we've got significantly more data, and I wouldn't be surprised if it kept going up even with COVID. Because I don't think we got some like pauses on evictions and stuff, but I don't think there was ever a proper rent cap put in. And I can't believe I don't know that now that I'm saying it, but I've just had too much American information come into my head the last week. Um, yeah, capital gains went and set fire to negative gearing, and then everybody suffered. Housing value, like the average capital gain, increased like crazy, and the government's not taking their 50% off that, so they're losing billions. And then what you claim as a loss with your negative gearing is even more because your health is worth more now. So, anyway. If negative gearing is too tough to touch, then the treatment of capital gains needs to be reformed to remove the double incentive of being able to buy a property, claim a loss, and then sell it and get a tax benefit from the capital gain. But okay, we know, that won't happen in this environment, the tax reform. So what about, I don't know, doing something about supply? Brings us to option 2. Make it easier to build. The Grattan Institute has been looking at housing for some time. In one of its most recent reports noted that, unlike most developed countries, Australia has had little increase in housing per person in the past 2 decades. The obvious solution is to increase supply, and one way is through actually making this easier to occur. I hate the phrase developed countries. I was always confused by it as a young person, and I've come down on why now because I've become a little bit of a history nerd. So it's like developed and undeveloped. Like, what about, because people don't refer to, for example, Thailand as a developed country. It's not first or third world, which is another like loaded, like racy term. But it's developing, I suppose. But the thing is, it's just not fully extractive. It's kind of lopsided. It has maybe a lot of pressure on the smaller countries around it, but it wasn't a colonial power the way that, for example, the colony of Australia is, and has an outsized influence on the region around it and is able to extract from them and extract from our native population who are hugely disenfranchised. So developed countries are just extractive countries. You look at like Norway and Finland, who aren't actively doing colonial weird bullshit, or having, disenfranchised ex-victims like, France or America, and they just got out at a respectable time and doubled down on the profits they already had without having to repatriate any, so unlike most extractive countries, Australia has had little increase in housing per person in the past 2 decades. The Grand Institute is another policy group like the Australia Institute. It's been around for, I think, since 2008 or so. It describes itself as independent in the sense that it doesn't take commissioned work, but its sponsorship is a bit, yeah. So we got like government money here. They've given more than $1 million to Grattan Institute over the time it's been around. We've got University of BHP, fucking NAB, And like, I don't know what these guys are thinking when they fund this stuff. It might just be that like when Grattan puts out something that they like, they promote it, or they get a tax write-off, or they get to say, oh look, we're some of this stuff goes into research. It's not purely profit for our CEO or something like that. I think most think tanks and policy things work this way. Oh, established in 2008. Yeah, it's right there. But they seem to do pretty good work, and they seem to do pretty good work about housing as well. But I haven't read a huge amount of their stuff. All right, so this was a submission made in 2022. This is where we originally were. The National Housing and Homelessness Agreement needs urgent repair, March 2022. And if you look to the left over here, housing has become less affordable for many Australians. Australia hasn't built enough housing to meet rising demand. What the next National Housing and Homelessness Agreement should do. And we've got recommendations here. Actually, I've read this before. It has some cool graphs. Yeah, check this. It's so fucking embarrassing, baby. Look at this. Unlike most developed countries, Australia has had little increase in housing per person in the last 2 decades. And this is dwellings per 1,000 people, 2000 and 2020, or the latest available data. So for Australia here, look, the dots are touching. They're not going either way. Now, we've had a couple of countries decrease. Czech Republic and Iceland, the share of public housing has decreased. But everybody else is increasing at least a little bit. Our fellow colonies over here, a small amount of increase. Oh, Luxembourg also decreasing, but that's basically a city-state like the Vatican, that's not a real fucking country. So it's still, oh God. Yeah, look at all those arrows and then look at Australia. What? Fucking numpties. Damn. That hurts to look at. Home ownership is falling particularly fast for low-income earners. Yeah, that's... Alright. 1981, 2016. So from 1981 to 2016, equivalized household income quintile. So this is the lowest quintile over here. Huge drop from 1981 to 2016. Whereas with the over 55s, there's been a drop still, but way less significant and a much smaller drop. Yeah, they've moved from 78%-ish down to maybe 60%, but for 25 to 34-year-olds in the poorest quintile, you've gone from just over 60% to just over 20%. That's miserable. That's really miserable. Oh, this is the same as graph. Okay, I've gotten distracted. It's probably worth reading too, but I don't want to add more to my plate right now. So the Grattan Institute has been looking at housing for some time, and in one of its most recent reports noted that Australia has had little increase in housing per person in the past 2 decades. And the obvious solution is to increase supply, and one way is through actually making this easier to occur. Australia's planning rules are highly restrictive and very much favour NIMBYism, which always just refers to people who already, it says right here, that only serves to protect those who own a house over those who wish to become owners. Yeah, like, not in my backyard is some, like, you're part of a community, dipshit. Like, contribute to your community. Your view of the river, it would be sad if you lose that, but it would be sadder if everybody else has to stay in shit rentals that flood every couple of years. So, a federal government could also provide incentives to local governments to open up areas for medium-density housing, i.e. increasing the supply. And I went on a rant last time about Airbnb and how like those are technically hotels and you're in residential areas. It's not zoned for hotel stuff, and how it was disruptive and did a lot of shit. And I felt like it should, if it wasn't actually illegal. Someone on Blue Sky verified that for me. They sent me like some links to, yeah, you just couldn't find the Airbnb stuff you were looking through at a glance because there's been so much written about them since it's been buried, and they probably did some work to like repeat those search terms in order to bury it, because you can game search engine optimization that way. So I won't get into that just now, but it's the same zoning issue. And if you let zoning get complicated by random third parties being like, oh, for the purposes of our online form, this is like appropriately zoned, like, fuck off. So Greg Jericho's third suggestion is actually, sorry, I'll go back to make it easier to build. Yeah, support trades, make it easier for children to get apprenticeships. That's something that I'm pretty sure Howard had a hand in fucking up, because the number of kids who used to be able to like do an apprenticeship while they were at school, while I was in high school, there were definitely kids doing that, and now it's just like dropped off. And I think part of that is they don't have the same student like youth allowance support for that, or like there's no the rules about how you paid them and what hours they had to do, or the paperwork. There are a few changes that came through. I remember it just like kind of dropped off towards the time I was graduating. And also mining and gas extraction, all that stuff hoovers up tradies. Like they get relocated to these things that do not benefit the community, do not pay taxes in a majority of the time, do not contribute meaningfully to like on-site like gross national product, like gross domestic product is like based in Australia, the amount of money it's making, but a gross national product, like not so much, like the per capita income or what have you, like they don't provide enough jobs at least to offset the amount of fucking pollution and like environmental despair they're wrecking. So stop taking our tradies. Like, give tradies the ability and also the chance to develop the skills to actually build stuff. Which comes back to like building slowed down so much during COVID as well because of supply line issues, right? Like, address some of those things. Don't make it so prohibitive to start. Right, back to the third point. Replace stamp duty with land taxes. Stamp duty, in the words of the Governor of the Reserve Bank, Philip Lowe, is a tax on mobility, on people moving location. He added that, if we're looking for an economy that's dynamic and vibrant, we want to remove excess taxes on mobility. Sorry, I put excess in there. He just said, we want to remove taxes on mobility. I'm scrambled. The government's current plan involves giving tax incentives to those aged over 55 if they sell their home. Now, Australian federal election 2022, Scott Morrison, Anthony Albanese coalition Liberal Party superannuation housing campaign launch. Fuck, I can't remember. Oh, this is just yeah. It's another super concession. So not only could you withdraw super if you want to buy a home, now there's a super concession if you sell your home. This is that evil cultist. But being able to put $300,000 into superannuation from the sale of their home only further distorts the already horrendous distortions in the superannuation system, which will again favour those who already own houses, and who would now have an advantage over those first home buyers competing for the same 2 or 3 bedroom homes. Yeah, you're letting like the young people tap into their super to get their first home, which will drive the prices up because the real estate agents knows there's more money in the pool now. And the old person who sells their home, especially if they want to like retire somewhere quieter, is now getting a kickback of $300,000. And so when they move to their new retirement location and go to buy there's an additional $300,000 that I presume, I don't necessarily know, it's either increasing their overall wealth or increasing what they can like buy a house with when they move, which means that once again they have the advantage they have over the first home buyers is entrenched. Like, insane. Just it was a kickback. I mean, Scott Morrison's government did nothing but pork barrel the whole time. So it is an ineffective it is ineffective as a tax incentive to overcome the tax problem of stamp duty. So why not remove stamp duty instead of further distorting the superannuation and housing system? But these are all the private sector side of things. Let's be honest, over 40 years of evidence has shown that the private sector will not provide a solution. This is stamp duty is something I've always just like the fact that you have to pay like a special conveyancer to make sure you're like selling property legally is like a weird thing. Land taxes makes a lot more sense. So Greg's next point is build more public and social housing. My colleagues at the Australian Institute's Nordic Policy Centre have noted that a major issue with Australian housing policy is that it regards housing as an asset rather than a need. Now, yeah, Greg is associated with the Australia Institute, which is another policy think tank, but I think it's been around since like the 1980s or the 1990s. They do generally good work. They're pretty centrist. I mean, centrist is left now, and the Nordic Policy Centre is just like, oh, like these Nordic countries, like I don't know, Norway and Finland and Sweden, they have great, like, they don't have problems with homelessness and stuff. Yeah, it's partly because they cashed out really early and they have small homogenous populations. Like they're not. I mean, yeah, we should take ideas from them, and they do have great policy which considers like everybody as at least inherently human, which Australia, because we are a colony with second and third class citizens, doesn't or can't. There are huge obstacles there in being fair and applicable. But that idea, like when people float around Nordic, it's like, oh, I want to be socialist Nordic style, not like a Latin American style. And you're like, well, Latin American socialist countries would have done great if the CIA wasn't constantly killing them. You know, like what the hell did you do to Guatemala? Don't you know? So just the Nordic used as like a positive description here, or kind of like a flag for so branding, like it's a marketing word here. It just kind of like raises my hackles a bit. Like, yeah, okay, like how'd you make your money, bro? Like, where'd your national wealth come from? Like, you've managed it very well, and we should manage ours like yours. But yeah, okay, I got segued. So Greg does work at the Australian Institute on like their economic board or whatever, writes a bunch of good stuff for them. They have a Nordic Policy Centre that I think focuses on housing. Nordic Policy Solutions. Or do they just like look at everything those guys do and what can we take? Social, environmental, and economic success of the Nordic nations. Research, stakeholder engagement, one of the most influential think tanks, okay. Yeah, so that's just what I said, except it's not focused on housing. Professor Andrew Scott notes that from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, the Commonwealth shifted most of its funding to assist payment of rent, including for tenants in the private sector, rather than giving more support to the states to supply public housing. This is true. I mean, like, I'm on a pension, right? I'm fucking disabled, and I do get rent assistance. And rent assistance is curtailed sharply if you're partnered. You get a little raise if you have children or stuff, but it's not attuned to the market. It's just capped. Well, maybe it was attuned to market at one point, but it seems to be kind of arbitrary now. It'll only. So there's a cap on it, and rents keep rising, and you get more up until the cap if your rent is more expensive, but it hasn't kept pace with how crazy the housing market has been. And yeah, I would rather have public housing than be paying some random landlord more money to get negative geared, you know? So that's the thing. I wish they would link directly to the professors and like Soles and stuff when they dropped their names, because I'd like to have a look at this guy's profile. Anyway, this meant that by the mid-1990s, public housing became seen increasingly as residual welfare housing. The move away from public and social housing to incentivizing private housing is clear when you consider that in the past year, so like 2021 to 2022, around 10% less public housing was built than in 1970, despite our population now being double what it was then. And have a graph here, number of public dwellings built, houses, apartments and flats. Oh, global financial crisis stimulus. I should just have kept that going. Yeah, that's really a sharp dip leading into 1980. Recovered a bit in 1985, but then just trended downwards until we get to like the Howard years, where it's kind of fixed. Yeah, steady but still trending downwards, except for this blip. This is interesting. How many? Back to 1,000. Oh, okay. So yeah, it's plateaued with the occasional dip. And this is Australian Bureau of Statistics data. Professor Scott notes that this is a purposeful state of affairs, not a natural one. He says, in Sweden, public housing is more than triple the proportion it is in Australia. One solution he proposes also involves the superannuation sector. But rather than, in effect, trying to individualise the gains that occur from the community pool of superannuation, he recommends instead the Australian government should now require some of the collective capital in superannuation funds to be invested in affordable housing to ensure fund members can have an adequate retirement. I love that. That's good. If we're going to have superannuation anyway, yeah, invested in this, since you're insisting on maintaining the housing bubble, making sure that people who pay into superannuation are protecting their own retirement, are protecting their own ability to have shelter, have housing. Instead of it just being floating stocks, make sure that a percentage of that superannuation has to go into improving the stuff the government should be doing, the regular tax stuff, like ensure road quality, ensure housing, ensure adequate schools, ensure... The Australian government should now require some of the collective capital in superannuation funds to be invested in affordable housing to ensure fund members can have an adequate retirement. And his final policy idea, housing and rental cooperatives. Another Nordic policy that could be pursued involves cooperatives. As Professor Scott puts it, rental housing cooperatives exist to provide housing, not accrue wealth. In a cooperative, the building or property is owned by a legal entity of which the residents are members and joint owners. And I've seen a lot of success stories, I guess, the human interest stories in news come through in the last 5 years of groups of friends essentially doing this, having a little commune where they got a little cluster of houses, but they own it mutually together, and that way they can live near their friends and have a community in retirement. This is a similar thing. I know there's a bunch of co-ops in northern New South Wales and stuff, which are lovely, but they do seem a little bit for someone who hates leaving the house to talk to people unless it's strictly necessary. Those are private co-ops, not municipal or council co-ops. So I'm not sure if this is exactly what he's talking about. Let's see. Sweden's housing cooperatives amount to 22% of the total housing stock, while it is 15% in all of Norway, but 40% in the capital, Oslo. As his colleague Dr. Sidsel Grimstad notes, it is similar in many ways to strata title in Australia, where a body corporate of the residents manages the shared spaces jointly. But the main difference is that a housing cooperative is user-owned, while the strata title is investor-owned. Yeah. A key aspect of cooperative housing is that you must live in the dwelling, not use it as an investment. And for rental cooperatives, tenants do not own their dwelling, but instead, as Grimstad notes, rent it affordably from a non-profit housing organisation, and they are actively involved in decision-making and management of maintenance and outdoor areas. Will these be what everybody wants? Obviously not, but it highlights that there are numerous different paths ahead that don't involve pumping up demand and pumping up prices. Yeah, I think because cooperatives are rare in Australia, probably the private cooperatives that I've seen are basically this Nordic style, except I wasn't familiar with them, and when I was looking at there were like the sale listings and stuff. I didn't understand what would go into it and what conditions there would be to that ownership compared to uh, normal housing ownership. It was I, I mean, it's not common, so I don't know. And a lot of this stuff, especially from state to state, can be confusing anyway. But I do like that idea. Like, a lot of people just want more of a say and not to be paying to a massive leech who's preventing them from ownership. Like, if you work in the city and you buy in with a co-op, then you can go retire, like buy your own house then, but you don't want to have all of the work of the maintenance and mowing the yard and all that stuff on your shoulders. So no wonder it's 40% in Oslo, you know? Greg Jericho is a guardian columnist and policy director at the Center for Future Work. What the hell is the Center for Future Work? Oh, okay. It's an initiative of the Australia Institute to conduct and publish progressive economic research on work, employment, and labour markets. Yeah. Alright, cool. Alright, so our second article is about a historical rental reform thing that happened in the UK. I say historical, I think it was the 1960s. They'll get into it in the article. But this is a write-up from The Guardian in like 2024. Nick Bano, who I feel like he might specialize in this. That name is familiar. Nick Bano specializes in representing homeless people, residential occupiers, and destitute and migrant households in both public law and private law disputes. Yeah, damn, like, he's a hardworking guy. That's such a British face. He's got the depressed air of that guy who plays Bernard from Black Books, right? Like, just that he's weighed down by the suffering he fights against. Leading junior in the Legal 500, United Kingdom 2025. UK, oh, damn, okay. Nick has a particular specialism, okay, in cases where social entitlements overlap with equality and discrimination law. He's been instructed in many of the key cases in this area, including TM vs Metropolitan, Ford vs Alderwick, and London and Quadrant vs Patrick on the public sector equality duty in housing possession claims, and Esochu vs Lewisham on discrimination against homelessness applicants. Whoever wrote this is using English in an interesting way, and I'm not sure if that's because I'm Australian or because they're Ponzi, like, Shit. Damn, okay. You can have a look at his court cases. It's a really nice website design. The language choice, a little bit off. I don't think he wrote it, you know. Year of call. I wonder what that means. Like when he came on board with this Garden Court Chambers thing, I guess. But anyway, back to his article, The End of Landlords. Speaking against his own government's renters reform bill last autumn, 2023, the Tory grandee, Sir Edward Lee, told MPs, "I was able to buy my first house, although it was a bit of a struggle, for £25,000. The opportunities for young people are so difficult now. Younger people are overwhelmingly reliant on the rental sector," Lee conceded, but the problem as he saw it was one of supply. "We have to build many more houses and we have to free up the rented sector." What never seems to occur to Lee, his parliamentary colleagues, or indeed his entire generation, is to look seriously at what has changed between their time and ours. The forthcoming general election is once again likely to be dominated by claims about a housing shortage and a dire need to build more homes. House building is an article of faith across the political spectrum. The evidence, however, does not support this thinking. Quite the reverse. Over the last 25 years, there has not just been a constant surplus of homes per household, but the ratio has been modestly growing, while our living situations have been getting so much worse. In London, as the Conservative Home blog notes, Conservative Home. Oh, right, it is just. Oh my goodness. Right, I thought it might be like a government agency or something, but it seems like it's kind of a news aggregate site. Or because they use Tory to talk about what in Australia are capital L Liberals and what in America is capital R Republican. So I'm not sure. I can't tell from all these fucking English concerns and terms what's going on here. I mean, like, what the Tory diary by rights should we just be shitting on Tories all the time? But I mean, their version of Labour is just Tory light. Hybrid models. Okay, so he is quoting a blog here, not a special conservative policy think tank, as far as I can make out. Unless, do they have an about? Engaging events and daily year-round coverage. Conservative Home is Britain's leading independent conservative news and analysis site. Okay, right, so it is a type of journalism. The fact that they're not outright condemning Tories every time Tories show up is a red flag as far as I'm concerned. In London, as the Conservative Home blog notes, there is a terrible housing crisis, even though its population is roughly the same as it was 70 years ago, when the city was still extensively bomb damaged by the Second World War. Damn, like, its population stayed the same? That's crazy. Although I guess they kind of maxed out what their island can handle. At some point, they wouldn't have been able to increase density by much. In terms of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries, so OECD, the UK has roughly the average number of homes per capita, 468 per 1,000 people in 2019. We have a comparable amount of housing to the Netherlands, Hungary, or Canada, and our housing stock far exceeds many more affordable places such as Poland, Slovenia, and the Czech Republic. It is impossible to make a case for unique levels of housing scarcity in Britain in comparative international or historical terms. What has changed for the worse is not the amount of housing per household, but its cost. And cost, in turn, has a great deal to do with the landlordism that is at the heart of the present crisis. God. Protesters outside the National Landlord Investment Show in London. I remember this. There was that interview with that landlord complaining about how hard it was for him and how nobody appreciated the work he did into maintaining his properties. But it turned out that he owned, like, people were like, it sounds like he owns like one extra house and it's, like left. He made it sound like he was really put upon and struggling, but he turned out to be a multi-millionaire with like 2,000 investment properties or something like that. Let me, I don't know how I would even find like a TikTok from that far back. I don't think it was a TikTok. It was just like a Instagram reel maybe. National Landlord Investment Show. What a disgusting. Oh, is this him? Was he that big a news thing? I remember his ugly face, so we'll see. Oh, they don't have a picture, so I don't know if it's the same guy. this guy. Oh man, I'm gonna be upset if I can't figure out what this video is. National Landlord Investment Show Protest. If I can find these articles, I might be able to find him just being commented on. Not here. Not here. Oh, I accidentally deleted my search terms. Damn, that's really frustrating. Alright, so I found the guy. I haven't found like his name or what have you. I just remember this mug. And no one in this. It turns out Google has a thing for searching short videos now. Is how I was able to find him. But as I recall, this guy, his identity and his investment portfolio was revealed at some point after this. But it's hard to search. So now, how do I share the sound with you? Why is he muted? Oh, I've probably got no? Interesting. Oh, this is so embarrassing. I don't know where the fucking sound is for...
Not all, but some of the costs. Like children to parents, they run, mummy, daddy, government, take care of me. Take care of me, government. Government's the answer. Government is not the answer.
But I suppose that they're not just saying that government's the answer, they're saying that the private landlords should themselves have compassion and shouldn't just gouge renters for everything that they're worth in the cost of living crisis.
I would personally argue that vast majority of landlords have great compassion. But
have you increased your rents during the cost of living crisis?
Of course, because we're passing on our costs in turns.
But is that compassionate?
Well, if we don't pass on our rents, if we don't pass on inflation, tax hikes,
just fucking sell your property if you can't afford it, you dumb shit. Like, oh my god.
So we have
no choice. No one will have a home.
Some, not all, but some of the costs.
Oh, you're stupid. No, they just rent from... Oh my god. I mean, there's so much wrong with everything that he's saying, and I mean, there are people dedicated to like arguing against people like this. There are, like, I mean, I belong to the Renter and Housing Union of Australia, by the way. So I don't do much except add merch to my wish list at Christmas. But you can get all of that info, the Eviction Fighting Fund, Friends of Rahu, get involved, public campaigns, this kind of thing. Housing is a necessity, and because it is a necessity and because we criminalize people for being homeless, we must protect it. It is like the government's mommy daddy. Well, no, the government is supposed to be representative of people and protect their rights and interests. Like, I won't spend any more time on him. Here's another one who was just like, oh yeah, I didn't need to, but of course I raised the rents. I can make more money. Like, fuck that guy. I'm gonna go back to this after I'm done reading these things and see if I can find the docs on that fucking Ichabod looking loser. who thinks that he's compassionate. But where were we? Yeah, protesters outside the National Landlord Investment Show in London. I can't believe they have their own little Comics Con. That's so awful. In the 1970s, when Lee's contemporaries were buying their first homes, they were the direct beneficiaries of an imploding private rental market. Rent controls, secure tenancies, and high interest rates had conspired to decimate the sector. It shrank from nearly 60% of dwellings in England and Wales in 1939 to just 9% in 1988, towards the end of Margaret Thatcher's premiership. This was welcomed by Conservative governments and Labour councils alike. The former rejoiced that rack-renting landlords were having to sell up to new owner-occupiers, while the latter enthusiastically repurposed existing private lets into new social housing stock. What is rack-renting? Rack rent denotes two different concepts. Firstly, an excessive rent. Secondly, the full rent of a property, including both land and improvements, if it was subject to an immediate open market rental review. The second definition is equivalent to the economic rent of the land plus interest on capital improvements plus depreciation and maintenance, the normal market rent of a property, and is not inherently excessive. Also, this may be different from the rent actually being received. Alright, so an excessive rent is the first meaning. The second one we can ignore, like it's not too relevant here. So, so private rents had shrunk. It started off at nearly 60% of dwellings in Wales. Dwellings in England and Wales. 60% of those were privately rented, shrank by 51%. So that in 1988, okay, so how you got a few decades in there, like 40 odd years, but you're losing 10% of these private rents at a time to home ownership. At a time, I mean per year. Per decade. Let me read this again, since I've confused the numbers. In the 1970s, when Lee's contemporaries were buying their first homes, they were the direct beneficiaries of an imploding private rental market. Rent controls, secure tenancies, and high interest rates had conspired to decimate the private rental sector. It shrank from nearly 60% of dwellings in England and Wales in 1939 to just 9% in 1988, towards the end of Margaret Thatcher's premiership. This was welcomed by Conservative governments and Labour councils alike. The Conservative governments rejoiced that rack-renting landlords were having to sell up to new owner-occupiers, while the latter enthusiastically repurposed existing private lets into new social housing stock. That's the Labour councils. The project of municipalising the private sector enjoyed cross-party support, with landlords desperate to sell and councils having access to preferential public loans and grants. There was not even a need for compulsory purchases, and social housing stocks could grow cheaply, sustainably, and without a single new brick being laid. In the 1970s, Harold Wilson's government issued circulars encouraging municipalisation. The Chancellor Denis Healey made £200 million available in the budget, and Wilson's good, sensible socialist government criticised Edward Heath's Conservatives for adopting municipalisation funding criteria that had been too generous. Almost a carte blanche, complained a Labour minister. So Labour is criticising the Tories for being too generous. That could open people up to corruption or what have you, but just like Labour criticising Tories for being too too anti-landlord, I guess. I mean, I don't think they would have described themselves that way necessarily, but what a crazy situation. Looking at what they have now. In 1973 and 1974 alone, Camden Council acquired more than 4,000 privately rented homes through voluntary sales, which, at a stroke, reduced the London borough's private rented sector by about 10%. A contemporaneous article proposed municipalisation as a route towards the end of landlordism in London, explaining that With commitment, it could be achieved in 6 years. It could be easy. It would be easy to do it in 10. And landlordism, that is. And of course, there was an upswing in owner occupation as Lee's generation dispossessed the reviled landlords of the post-Rockman era. In fact, the first use of the word gentrification, in the 1960s, was intended to describe this phenomenon of replacing the squalor of urban rented housing with a new class of younger owner-occupiers, instead of, as it does today, connoting the ritualistic slaughter of social housing and the elimination of the urban poor. Early gentrification was offset by radical councils such as Lambeth aiming to achieve a surplus of high-quality social housing in order to abolish the need for waiting lists and qualification criteria. Even the Tories' political education department had no real objection to the further reduction of the tiny private rented sector that existed in the 1970s. It wrote, "The accelerating decline of the privately rented sector is quite irreversible. The private landlord, as he exists now and has existed, will, within a generation, be almost as extinct as the dinosaur. There is nothing that can be done about this." Conservatives in the 1970s merely sought to retain a handful of petty landlords who ought to be entitled to a fair return if they let out a spare room or two, but they recognized that private renting tends to be an expensive, poor quality, and economically wasteful way of accommodating the population. The near death of landlordism was one of the good news stories of the last century. But the task that Thatcher and her successors set themselves was to undo that progress. The present system was designed, as the Supreme Court noted in a tenant's 2016 Human Rights Challenge, to ensure that the letting of private property will again become an economic proposition. It should have been obvious to everyone that a market that had achieved such positive effects by its collapse would produce equal and opposite consequences as it was reinflated. We now find ourselves in a situation where 1 in every 21 adults in the UK is a landlord. We have 4 times as many landlords as teachers. As a consequence, virtually everyone struggles to afford a home that meets their needs despite a net gain in housing stock. Landlords are entitled to ask for whatever rent they think they can get, and insecure contracts drive a coach and horse to the concept of tenants' rights. This is a market that Lee, landlords and developers want to free up. Instead of confronting the horror of our situation and its causes, they pretend that there is an extraordinary shortage of homes. This is simply untrue, as the international and historical data shows. Here, as in the US, we have been lured into a fruitless debate about supply. There is a confected dispute between anti-house building NIMBYs and pro-house building YIMBYs, led by energetic planning law abolitionists, which seeks to distract us from talking about the ultimate sources of the housing crisis. The supply issue continues to dominate the discourse despite the US having more homes per capita than at any point in its history, and the UK's homes per capita ratio actually exceeding the US's. The YIMBY argument has always seemed flimsy. Its strange logic is that speculative developers would build homes in order to devalue them, that they would somehow act against their own interests by producing enough surplus homes to bring down the average price of land and housing. That would be surprisingly philanthropic behavior. When we complain, rightly, that cities such as Vienna are so much more livable than anywhere in Britain, we must acknowledge that landlordism is holding us back. Our insistence on pursuing policies that ensure that letting private property is an economic proposition not only drives up prices for would-be homeowners, but it stands in direct opposition to a program of Our insistence on pursuing policies that ensure that letting private property is an economic proposition not only drives up prices for would-be homeowners, but it stands in direct opposition to a program of municipalizing and decommodifying the homes that already exist. It also inflates land values, making new state-led building projects unfeasible. If we want a Viennese-style existence, we can only achieve this, as we did 50 years ago, by driving landlords out, which is only fair. We have given them a very good innings. Despite a housing crisis that compounds itself every day, the government has indicated that its modest reforms to the private rented sector in England, proposed in 2019, will not be implemented in the foreseeable future. We are so beholden to landlords crying wolf that Parliament has spent 5 years failing to do the one thing that in 2019 every political party agreed needed to be done. Solving the housing crisis does not need to involve an ecologically unforgivable project of mass-scale house building. It does not need to involve asphalt and green belts, destroying precious amenities through infilling, converting office blocks into flats, or wasting government money on quixotic home ownership schemes. We simply need to relearn the wisdom of the last century, to acknowledge that landlordism is the enemy of affordability, and to ensure that the housing economy is not defined by the staggering rental yields that our unregulated market can produce. Our recent history shows us that landlord abolition, while maintaining adequate levels of housing stock, is an entirely realistic ambition. It is so modest a demand that it has been subsumed into Conservative Party policy. When we come across opponents of rent controls, it is worth considering that, by 20th century standards, they are the ones with the bizarre and radical demands. The extremists, the profiteers, the landlord apologists who believe in an economy that involves skimming as much passive income from other people's incomes as possible. If they are against rent controls, they believe that rents should be set by the market, which, in the context of urban housing, tends to mean monopoly prices. They believe in a mechanism that necessitates rising poverty, and by which the already wealthy thrive on other people's money. Where Adam Smith and Karl Marx found common ground was in the idea that everyone's interests are aligned against landlords. They are an economic deadweight. Even if we leave aside the appalling conditions and precarity that private renters face, anyone with an interest in lower taxes, lower wage bills, and increasing the number of first-time buyers must equally be interested in smashing the private rented sector to bits. Homebuyers are now forced to compete with landlords who chase sensational yields in our unregulated rental market, and £85.6 billion a year, which comes of course from wages and taxes, is wasted on rent. A renewed collapse of landlordism would represent not just the tenants' revenge for the housing crisis, but a much broader and more valuable moment of social progress. Nick Bano is a barrister specializing in renters' rights and homelessness law. His book, Against Landlords, How to Solve the Housing Crisis, is published 26th of March of, I assume that year, 2022, I think this was written. I should get a copy of that. Oh no, 2024. Okay, super recent. Anyway, yeah, fuck landlords. Like I'm always saying, if Mal got anything right, it's like landlords are scum.